Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another live stream. Thank you so much for tuning in for another show. Welcome to all of our members, subscribers, and viewers from wherever you are. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the first day of the ceasefire taking effect between Lebanon and Israel, the vibes that are coming from Lebanon, what's happening internally in Israel, what's going to happen with Gaza, especially with comments coming from senior figures inside of Israel that are linked to the sides that are opposing to have a ceasefire with Gaza, alongside the statements coming from Russia about targeting certain NATO bases inside of Europe. But we're going to start off, of course, with the main thing. The ceasefire came to effect today between Israel and Lebanon, and many Lebanese are seen going back to their homes and celebrating in the streets following their victory over Israel, the Israeli defeat in Lebanon, humiliation, left without accomplishing any of their objectives, and with their people being unable to go back to the north, like Benjamin Netanyahu stated previously, when all of the Lebanese were going back to their homes and villages in the southern suburb of Beirut, Al-Dahya al-Janubiyya, and also in the southern parts of Lebanon. So people were going back in numbers that Israel did not expect. Israel found it surprising that so many people are going back, especially to the southern areas. Israel destroyed many homes in the southern part of Lebanon. But people are going back. People are going back despite that, and despite some Israeli presence in those areas, going back to Beirut, going back to South Lebanon, celebrating, and finally returning to their homes. Meanwhile, Israel is, of course, trying to downplay everything when it comes to the accomplishment of Hezbollah, stating things like, we destroyed their biggest missile bases, and their celebrations are fake, alongside many other statements coming from mainstream media, some mainstream media, and some people who are leading figures inside of the Israeli establishment. But what we can see is evident: people going back south, some of them blatantly supporting the resistance as well, and Israel is still based in some of those locations. Now, there were no significant, if you want to call them, breaches of the ceasefire. The only things that were reported today in South Lebanon were that some tanks were shooting like warning shots at anyone trying to come close to them in the certain areas where they are still present in South Lebanon, although Israel already started to withdraw from 3 villages in South Lebanon, despite the fact that the agreement that they had gives them 60 days to withdraw from Lebanon. But the fact that you have these military brigades and units that belong to the occupying genocide entity withdrawing from now indicate how much they were exhausted by this battle, how much they've suffered, how much they have this defeated mentality of not wanting to remain in Lebanon following so much suffering and so many of their tanks gone, some of their soldiers gone, and how much Hezbollah inflicted damage on them. Hezbollah declared that they killed at least 130 Israeli soldiers in the ground battles, wounding over 1,250, destroyed over 70 Merkavas, alongside, of course, other targetings as well. These numbers do not include the damage inside of the occupied territories and how many were killed inside the bases that Israel targeted inside occupied Palestinian territories, but only in the South Lebanon battles where Israel actually invaded. So celebrations coming in Lebanon. Meanwhile, in Israel, we're having lots of problems in Israel. One of the most telling statements came from this man who is the chairman of a northern Israeli village called Margaliot. Margaliot was one of those areas that declared their independence at one point from the state of Israel. He came on Israeli television and he had this interview with them. Let's watch it and then we will go to the statements coming from more senior figures inside of Israel.
פה ממשלת ישראל עושה את הדברים בידיעה. ממשלת ישראל באה ומוסרת את תושבי הצפון לידי החיזבאללה. ממשלת ישראל כבר הכריזה היום על מלחמת לבנון הרביעית. ממשלת ישראל שולחת אותנו לגורלנו. ממשלת ישראל מעולם לא הייתה הפקרות כזאת. אם כל הזמן דיברו על אהוד ברק בשנת 2000 שהוא ברח מלבנון, פה זה הפקרות שלא הייתה כדוגמתה. זה פשע לעשות את זה לתושבי הצפון. לא יכולים לעשות דבר כזה לתושבי הצפון, לשלוח אותם כלעומת שהם באו. מה זה עדר כבשים? לשחיטה? לאן ביבי רוצה להביא אותנו? כל תושבי הצפון הסתובבתי אתמול בבתי מלון, 3 בתי מלון, אנשים באבל. מה קורה פה? ביבי, תבוא תשאר עם ראשי ועדים, ראשי מועצות, עם ראשי יישובים. מה זה פה? מדינה של איש אחד? תעצור רגע! לאן אתה רץ? שנה וחודשיים טובחים בנו, שנה וחודשיים הורגים בנו, שנה וחודשיים מפרקים אותנו, והיום אתה בא ורץ לחתום על כל נייר שלא יהיה, העיקר להשיג את הצבא מלבנון?
So this is basically the head of the Margaliot settlement in the north that, like I said, they declared that they actually cut their ties with the state at one point when there were more people talking about independence of the northern part from the central government after what they said, the neglect. After the neglect coming from the Israeli government against them, they are not able to go back, and Hezbollah are targeting them every day. So they're very frustrated with what's happening, especially with the fact that you have the Lebanese being able to go down to their villages back south in Lebanon, whereas the Israelis are not able to go back to the northern parts of Israel. That is for at least the initial phase of the ceasefire, which is 60 days. And these 60 days are very telling. Yesterday, we were talking about the fact that Hezbollah could have potentially added this as a condition, in effect, to continue the pressure on Israel, albeit without direct targeting, as in direct missile launching or fighting between them and Israel, because this is what it leads to. Internal fighting, and this criticism is not only coming from this man, this criticism is coming from many inside of the Israel establishment. So one of these people was, of course, Itamar Ben-Gvir. Itamar Ben-Gvir, he had an interview with the Israeli Channel 14. But this is in Hebrew. I'll tell you, brief details about what happened in this interview. Firstly, Channel 14 in Israel is a channel that belongs to the extreme right wing in Israel. So it supports Netanyahu, it supports Ben-Gvir, it supports the settlements, supports continuing the war, it supports expanding the war, it supports Israel controlling de facto the West Bank and Gaza and expanding to Lebanon. It supports everything that they want, the greater Israel. The ultra right-wing ideology inside of Israel. They were talking for the first time about prospect of a ceasefire in Gaza all of a sudden. Where is this talk coming from? This channel is supposed to be a channel that supports Netanyahu, supports expanding the war, and these figures inside of his cabinet. So they were asking Itamar Ben-Gvir, why are we now in a ceasefire in Lebanon? He was like, I opposed this ceasefire in Lebanon. He was the only man who voted against the ceasefire in Lebanon, but the rest of the cabinet members agreed to a ceasefire. He was saying, I find it unfortunate that I was the only person who voted against a ceasefire in Lebanon. But that's the situation we have now in Lebanon. And I'm not going to leave the government. And I'm going to kind of continue the pressure. Although this man previously said, I'm going to resign if we have a ceasefire with Lebanon. He said it outright. If we have a ceasefire with Gaza, I will resign. He said, if we have a ceasefire with Lebanon, I will resign. All of a sudden, he's not resigning. So what we're starting to see here is, in fact, an implementation of what I was speaking about a couple of months ago about Netanyahu using this potentially to try and climb down the ladder, depending on how far he goes. And now, well, they have a ceasefire in Lebanon. So he was asked, well, now you have a ceasefire with Lebanon. Why don't you have a ceasefire with Gaza? Isn't it time now to have a ceasefire with Gaza? This is what the channel is saying. Again, an unusual tone coming from them. And he's saying, oh no, Gaza is different. It's not the same. Gaza is a bigger thing. And we need to continue. Well, you said the same thing about Lebanon. We need to continue up until we eliminate Hezbollah. We need to continue up until this and that. And eventually, you're still in a government that had a ceasefire with Lebanon. First and foremost, because of the level of fierce resistance coming from Lebanon against Israel. That's number one. But there are many other contributors to that too. But the main thing is the fact that Israel is still getting a beating and suffering internally from what's been inflicted upon them by the resistance. Defeated mentality. The person himself is getting criticism. Benjamin Netanyahu is getting criticism, like the man that I showed you before. The vibe coming from the people, what are we doing here? Whether they humiliated us. The opposition, again, criticizing. All of the opposition almost criticizing Benjamin Netanyahu about how much of a shameful submission agreement, they're calling him, a submission agreement to Lebanon it is. Benny Gantz, people in the military or were in the military, well, Benny Gantz himself, he was the chief of staff. The other man who was the chief of staff and who was previously a member of the war cabinet, Gadi Eisenkot, he also criticized the ceasefire with Lebanon heavily as well. So we're having a clear picture here of who won and who lost in this confrontation with Lebanon, at least since the escalation. Because before, Hezbollah declared we're a supporting front with limited attacks on Israel up until they have a ceasefire with Gaza, up until we reach the stage where, and Hezbollah were of course trying to avoid reaching an all-out war with Lebanon. They succeeded with that up until 2 months back. This came simultaneously with the increased pressure internally on Benjamin Netanyahu. So he had to escalate so that he can take away some of that pressure so that people can start focusing on Lebanon, sending 5 divisions up north, enough divisions to go into central Lebanon. But well, almost the same number of the Lebanese army, the whole of the Lebanese army. They have about 90,000 soldiers in Lebanon. 5 divisions of Israel consisted of over 65,000 armed soldiers for the genocide. So they faced massive humiliation from Lebanon. And now they are, well, at least the media that is supportive of Netanyahu, supportive of this man, now they are slowly trying to talk about the prospect of a ceasefire with Gaza. It's as if everything is already arranged and understood, but there are certain steps to be taken up until we reach that stage so that Israel is not seen to be as the country accepting all of a sudden a ceasefire with Lebanon and a ceasefire with Gaza at the same time without achieving any of their military objectives, because it would be looking like a much bigger failure than what it is already looking for Israel, by the evidence on the ground, by the fact that we are still having resistance against Israel. from Gaza and from other fronts too, and by the fact that they are struggling very much internally. So we have that, of course, when it comes to Lebanon, but the war in Gaza hasn't officially stopped. The war in Gaza is still there. There were several interviews on a couple of Arab media networks with people from Gaza asking them, what do you think about the ceasefire in Lebanon? And all of the people were saying, we congratulate that. That's a great thing for Lebanon, and we hope that the thing is implemented in Gaza as well. None of them had any sort of negative talk or anything to say. They said Lebanon was the first country to participate and help us. They sacrificed so much for us. They deserve a ceasefire. However, we also deserve a ceasefire too now. And it looks like this might be where things are heading again, even if it might be short-lived, or even if it's for a limited amount of time, because the scale of what happened in the past year is unlike any phase in the history of Israel previously. So we still have Israel committing crimes. In Gaza, they had an attack on a 5-story building in Beit Lahia housing women and children, refugees. And reports said that over 100 martyrs from that attack on Beit Lahia. That's in the northern part of Gaza. So they are still targeting the innocent civilians, trying to apply more pressure on them, and taking all of their sadism. What Israel is doing is sadistic. It's pure sadism. You're talking about a psychopathic state that finds pleasure in the torture and suffering of other people. And that's why they are trying to inflict as much damage on these people already suffering, innocent people, through this genocide and mass starvation campaign. But despite all of that, they're unable to touch the Palestinian resistance. And we were talking about Beit Lahia. This was a video coming from Al-Qassam brigades in Beit Lahia. That's one of the most northern parts of Gaza, by the way. One of the most northern parts in Gaza. Targeting machinery and tanks of Israel with their own produced Yasin 105 RPG launcher and RPG warhead. And they also obtained one of their quadcopters in Gaza too. But as we can see, this is one of the most hardly hit areas in Gaza. Yet the Palestinian resistance is still able to do that to the occupying genocide forces inside of Gaza. Netanyahu was saying that we want to continue this campaign to apply military pressure on Hamas. Of course, his declared main objective is to eliminate the Hamas. However, he's nowhere near that. The only thing he's doing is eliminating his soldiers in Gaza in those locations that are most hardly hit. We're still having attacks on the Israeli forces, occupying forces present in Rafah, conducting mass terror in Rafah. And the Palestinian resistance is still targeting them there. Every time they have any limited invasion into one of the territories they were in before, again, on its own, a fact that indicates that they have failed in their military objective against the resistance, because they have to go back. Well, why do you have to go back? You have to go back because there are still people fighting, and you haven't taken away any of the pressure against you when it comes to the armed resistance. And of course, you are implementing, in terms of Israel, a campaign of ethnic cleansing. That's the main thing you want to do, a campaign of ethnic cleansing and destruction against the Palestinian people. And even with that, you're failing. People are still, even in Gaza, despite all of the beyond horror scenes that are happening in North Gaza, deciding to remain in the north. So we're seeing something happening. We have more talks coming from figures on the Palestinian side, that there are indeed talks about a ceasefire in Gaza, but the Palestinian resistance is outright refusing any ceasefire that won't include ending the war, a complete ceasefire, withdrawing the Israeli genocide terror forces, withdrawing from Gaza, alongside their other main conditions, allowing all of the people back everywhere in Gaza, then getting all of the aid in, and then, of course, rebuilding Gaza. The Palestinian resistance, from their perspective, there are no halfways. They've tried this halfway before. It didn't work. Israel restarted the war. They don't want to put the Palestinian people in the same position again. From their perspective, if we do have a ceasefire, it has to be a concrete ceasefire. And again, that position does not come from a side that is being defeated. That position doesn't come from a side that is weak. That position comes from a side that is winning, that is brave, that is heroic in confrontation, and is willing to sacrifice. And that's what we're seeing, because there were several offers on the table that would include, a limited ceasefire, but again, nothing for the Palestinians, and only that, some of these prisoners of war, they need to be released. And that's something that the Palestinian side is not going to be accepting. Which leads me to, well, I just wanted to share one thing with you before I go to the last point. You see, there are many people who talk about, the Judeo-Christian nation, right? The Judeo-Christian values, trying to, from a Christian perspective, falsely claim that these people are God's chosen people, and they are our allies, and but this is what they've been doing in Lebanon. So we had this video being published of depraved genocide soldiers going to a church in Lebanon, and pretending to have a wedding. Look at this. And look at what they're saying. It's translated in English as well.
Oh, the great Mary.
מי מחתן אותנו?
קשו אליו. שם החתן? מוישה. שם הכלה? טוב, הגענו לערב הזה הגענו לערב הזה אחרי כמה זמן של זוגיות? 6 שנים. כאן בטקס הזה. הרי אתה מוכן לשים את כל... אני מתנגד! אני מתנגד! שקט! שקט! סולין, אני אוהב אותך! אני אוהב אותך, סולין! אני אוהב אותך!
So, as you can see, the Israeli soldiers going to a church and, of course, desecrating the church. They destroyed churches previously, saying, you know, it's the first wedding in the team, right, with the cross, and, mocking Mary, peace be upon her, and singing like Christians, so as in trying to make fun out of them. And they've done, of course, many things like that in mosques as well. They destroy them, you know, on a repeated basis. It just reveals the true nature of these people who, who some are trying to convince us are innocent, you know, peace-seeking people trying to defend themselves. What was it in the church here that was threatening them? And why were they mocking it? And why do they do all of these things constantly and repeatedly, you know, mocking people in their houses and, you know, the weird type of behaviors, you know what I mean, that reflect the level of sickness and sadism in these people and what they do. And that's the norm. That's the norm that the Palestinian people have been facing ever since the inception of this Zionist entity on the land of Palestine. Which leads me to the final thing that I wanted to share with you. We've been covering more and more about the developments when it comes to NATO and the proxy war in Europe. And now we're having more statements coming from Russia following the escalation coming from the United States and its proxies. So I had this report here. RT Medvedev does not rule out targeting NATO bases in Europe. Deputy Chairman of the Russian Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, said that Russia could not rule out a strike on NATO bases in European countries. But Moscow does not want this scenario. Again, echoing previous statements that we had from Russia and you know, previous interviews with President Vladimir Putin too, that they don't want this escalation, but that the United States is constantly pushing more and more provocations and attacks and reckless attacks inside of Russian territories, including against nuclear facilities. And now we had the missiles, of course, and there's more talk about giving the Ukrainian troops fighting under Zelensky more weapons to target Russia. Although we were at a phase multiple times of almost reaching a ceasefire, but there are some people profiteering at the expense of people's lives in Ukraine. And they are, I mean, there's nothing to explain it but leading the world to World War III. I mean, the levels of weapons being used now by Russia and these threats, they should be concerning everyone and wake people up from their, you know, apathy. There's a lot of apathy in Europe. There is a level of apathy. I mean, there are people who are aware of what their governments are doing, but in general, you're talking about apathy. And like, oh, you know, we don't know, and yeah, you know, the government says so, so we'll continue. And this apathy, primarily due to the fact that Europe hasn't really seen wars for the past 80 years, leads people to, you know, have this false sense of confidence. Yeah, you know, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. I'm sure, it's going to be sorted eventually. Oh, no, it's all, too dramatic or too unrealistic. No, it's not unrealistic. It's real. And it's primarily due to the United States militaristic oligarchy and its proxies and people profiteering of this war. And this is constantly escalating. And there are more reports now of European countries, NATO members. So NATO, basically, the European arm of the United States administration, escalating further. We had the senior figure yesterday talking about businesses needing to prepare for war. Have batteries and have water and what have you. And, I hope you have plan B or a nuclear cream or something that will protect you from a nuclear bomb or something. And we, of course, have more responses coming from Russia. And these were the main things that I want to talk to you about in this live stream. And let me open the space up for you. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. Glenn Huxley, thank you so much, my friend. And Trill Iman. Trill Iman is asking me, do you think Iran is still going to strike? I think Iran, similar to what they did back in July, they used their lack of response or their pending response as leverage to achieve political aims. And that's something clever to do, to use a level of pressure or the fact that you are about to respond and delay it for a while to see if certain political things can be achieved. Because ideally, you would want to achieve your rights without fighting. I mean, that's the clever thing to do. But of course, there's a military-industrial complex, there's people profiteering, and there are agendas by the United States and its proxies globally. Now, they haven't responded yet, but we have a development. We have a development in the form of a ceasefire with Lebanon. Fragile, not fragile, it could be broken, it could not be broken. That's all on the table, absolutely. But there is progress. The Iranians might wait and see if we might have a ceasefire in Gaza too. If we have a ceasefire in Gaza, well, good. Then they might have a limited strike. Why? Because their president said if the child murdering entity stops its war crimes, then we might consider the intensity of the response. Meaning, well, if you start behaving, we might, tone it down a little bit. Then we would have a ceasefire in Gaza, and Iran would potentially respond in, well, not a very, very large manner. And that wouldn't necessarily put Gaza and Lebanon at risk, by the way. No, it wouldn't necessarily do that. Because from their perspective, we're only dealing with Iran now. They already consider Iran the biggest threat. And they might either swallow it or just have another small exchange up until it fades out somehow, right? Because there are two arguments in Israel. One argument says that you need to take down all of the arms of Iran in the region and then reach Iran. So take down the Palestinian resistance, take down the Lebanese resistance, take down Syria, take down Yemen, and then reach Iran. That's the first argument. And the second argument in Israel is no, go and target what they call the head of the snake. They call Iran the head of the snake. Go and target Iran immediately. Why? Because they're causing all of these problems. And if we go and we attack them, right, or take them down, as they say, then they give everyone a lesson and they will stop this support, because the main resistance country is Iran. Iran is the big thing. Now, each location or front has its own unique qualities or special points that they have based on, you know, the people, the level of conflict, the history, all of that, capabilities, and it's not like they get everything from Iran, you know. So like the Palestinian side, the Palestinians develop a lot of what they have, if not the majority of them. So we might see that. And again, of course, Israel is nowhere near any of these things. Israel is nowhere near touching the Palestinian resistance. Now they submitted to Hezbollah. They bowed down, they kneeled down to Hezbollah. And Iran, what did they, I mean, when they had this big attack with hundreds of fighter jets in Iran, they were attacking them from Iraqi airspace. They were petrified to come even close to Iran. So it depends. Iran might use this as leverage to try and enforce, because today, actually, I mean, let me share that with you to kind of clarify further. We had a statement coming from an Iranian general, former commander of the Iranian army. He had a speech today during which he said this: Iranian general urges extension of Lebanon ceasefire to Gaza. Deputy Commander of Khatam al-Anbiya Central Headquarters, Brigadier General Muhammad Jafar Asadi, stressed out the need for cessation of the Israeli regime's crimes in the region. The ceasefire in Lebanon marked a victory for Hezbollah, and this ceasefire should become operational in Gaza too. Ryan, listen to the tone. Should become operational in Gaza too. And of course, you know, no one can deny that Iran was in the background, and now that they're expecting Israel to continue with the other ceasefire, so they can tell them, you know, we will consider the intensity of the response, like the Iranian president said before. The resistance front is pursuing a halt to the Zionist regime's crimes in Gaza, is following it up strongly, and expects the Lebanon ceasefire to become operational in Gaza too as soon as possible. He noted that Iran welcomes and supports the ceasefire deal in Lebanon, although it was not 100% favorable, saying the truce translates to victory to the resistance and a big defeat to the Zionist regime. Again, should become operational, and expects the ceasefire to become operational in Gaza too as soon as possible. You know, the tone, you can hear things between the lines, and what's between the lines is sometimes more than what is actually said. So, again, the situation could be as follows. Hezbollah told Israel, we will have a temporary ceasefire so long as you don't get your objective out of the ceasefire, which is returning the people back to the north, for 2 months. During these 2 months, you need to have a ceasefire with Gaza. Otherwise, there will be no continuation of this ceasefire. This would be slightly, you know, to the ignorant, saving Israeli face by them not agreeing to 2 ceasefires in one go, but at the same time achieving the objective, getting to a ceasefire. Tam, Mahmoud, what is happening in Syria? Just recently there are reports that there are more fighting in Aleppo. What's happening in Syria is very interesting. Thank you for actually asking that. On the first day of the ceasefire with Lebanon, some of the armed groups in Syria fighting the government have declared a massive offensive. These movements, many of them are backed by foreign countries like the United States and Turkey, and in some cases Israel too. There was a member of what's called, you know, the armed Syrian opposition the other day on a live chat with Avichai Adrei. Avichai Adrei, if you know him, he's a man who is a spokesperson for the Israeli army who speaks in Arabic. In his speech yesterday, that I shared with you, Benjamin Netanyahu said, we warn Syria, Assad, you're playing with fire. Why? Because Syria is the main line of supply for Hezbollah. All of a sudden today, with the ceasefire, these armed groups declare a massive offensive in an area that is one of the supply lines for Hezbollah. Is this a coincidence? I don't think so. I don't think it's a coincidence. I think any group tied, whether in a declared or a non-declared manner, with the United States, and again, that does not apply to all of the Syrian opposition, they have things aligned and coordinated with them. We had members of the armed groups fighting the government in Syria being treated in Israel, supported in Israel, supported by the same countries who support Israel. All of these things are very fishy. How successful would it be, or would it necessarily affect to a large extent the supply lines to Hezbollah? Not very much. But it's intended to send a message to the Syrian government that we are indeed serious. And if you don't play ball with us, if you don't stop or reduce arming Hezbollah, then we will create more problems for you in Syria. That's the message. However, when it comes to Syria and their supply lines to Hezbollah, I mean, you have so many. Firstly, you have big borders through the reaching the Beqa area, or the eastern valley of Lebanon, the Beqa Valley. I mean, this is where the armed resistance in Lebanon started, really, with the help of Syria in the Beqa Valley, in the eastern valleys of Lebanon. And then it spread out. You had camps over there, training camps and stuff, to train and fight the Zionist occupation at the time, with the support of Iran, of course. So they're trying to send a message to the Syrian government that you need to understand that we are indeed looking at a new reality. You can't ignore it. You can't go back to the days before. But they will not necessarily succeed. I don't think they will succeed at all, because we were already looking at a reconciliation process in Syria. The United States is withdrawing some of its bases inside of Syria. They left an oil rig not long ago, and it's not going in their favor. And we saw today the people going back to South Lebanon. These people are people who support the resistance fully. And again, all of this declared talk, don't take it too seriously. Like Hezbollah is not going to be armed in South Lebanon. They said the same thing after 2006. Everything will happen, everything will be coordinated with Lebanon and with the Lebanese army. And Hezbollah will be on the lines, on the front lines, facing the genocide state. And what they're trying to do with Syria also won't work. And thank you, Tam, for your questions. That's what's happening inside of Syria. And Bimati, Nareen, great, I hope so. But Iran said the response will be determined by any ceasefire. Well, yeah, what the Iranian president said is, if Israel stops committing crimes against children, stops its genocide, if they start to behave, we will consider the intensity of the response. So indicating that there will be a response, but the intensity of it will be different if you reach a ceasefire. Now, this ceasefire in Lebanon is a win for Iran. Let it be clear, it's a win for Iran. If it continues, and continues in Gaza too, of course, first and foremost, it's a win for the Lebanese resistance in Lebanon. And in Gaza, it will be a win for the Palestinian resistance, and primarily the Palestinian people who need a ceasefire. And a win for Iran as well. And again, if they do decide to conduct a limited attack on Israel afterwards, well, it would be between them and Israel. And we will then try and understand what would be the face-saving thing that would end this back and forth confrontation. Mystic Mother, so who apart from Hamas is going to help Gaza and the West Bank? Well, Hamas are of course leading the armed resistance in Palestine, but they are joined with other 12 armed resistance movements. And again, the ceasefire agreement with Lebanon is limited for 2 months. Hezbollah still left Israel with infighting because clearly this agreement that they had with Hezbollah does not allow the Israelis to go back to the north up until potentially we have a ceasefire with Gaza. That's my opinion. And there is no ceasefire with anyone else apart from Lebanon. And again, even with Gaza itself, I showed you the videos earlier on. They're still fighting them in the most hardly hit areas. Lydia is saying, Professor Morandi says Iran will strike big, but when? In 2 years' time? Look, we don't know. In the world of politics, things can change. And again, it depends on the achievements that are being made. Generally, if you want to have any political accomplishments, you would need to strive to get them without any violence, right? But that's not the norm imposed on the world by the United States and its proxies. The neo-colonialists, they always use violence to achieve their political or financial objectives. With Iran, like I just said before, if we do have a ceasefire in Gaza, that could be an indication for Iran that, okay, the region is heading towards de-escalation. We don't want to be the side that would tarnish that. And we might have something limited on Israel. But so far, we haven't had complete de-escalation. What happened in Lebanon is a sign. It's an Israeli admission that we are incapable. The Secretary General of Hezbollah, Sheikh Naim Qasim, told Israel 2 weeks ago, we will make you beg for a ceasefire. And that's what happened. We will make you beg for a ceasefire, and that is what happened. And that's why the Lebanese side received more than the Israeli side, even in this short temporary ceasefire. And again, we're still talking about the first day. Will there be problems? Will Israel use that to do something else? We don't know. And remember, we had a 45-day ceasefire just over 40 days into the genocide following the 7th of October. After 45 days, Israel restarted the whole war, and we're over 1 year, 1 month in. So remember that. We could see something similar in Lebanon. So the important thing now is to observe these developments that are happening between Israel and Lebanon, right? What Israel is doing in the background, or try and understand what they're doing in the background, to see where they might reach afterwards. We know that there's something written for 2 months. So that's the first thing. It's not like 45 days in the case of Gaza, just around a year ago. They're already talking about rearming. There are certain figures in Israel who are saying this is only temporary. We will continue with Hezbollah. These talks could be there to potentially take down the tensions when it comes to those who support the continuation of the war. But again, it could lead to a permanent ceasefire or a longer-term ceasefire. Marvin Marvin, you said, do you think Syria has any chance of getting the Golan Heights and Shib'a farms during this conflict? I think the Golan Heights case, we're talking about something that would potentially involve Syria directly, as in direct conflict. It's not like we didn't have attacks in Syria, we did. But again, Syria is facing internal issues as well. And if we want to talk about the Golan Heights, in my opinion, that will be a talk for when we are either, and that is unlikely, if we will either see an Israeli side willing to give up the Golan Heights, or not give up, hand back the Golan Heights, if we want to have a settlement, or during the case of an ongoing war of the final blow, basically. And so far, with Syria, well, there were very limited attacks from Syria on Israel, but it played a big role in the transferring of supplies to Lebanon. And of course, the coordination between Iran and Russia and the resistance too. These things are important. So not necessarily. I mean, in 1994, the Israeli prime minister who was looking to have a peace deal, Yitzhak Rabin, who was assassinated, he was potentially looking to have a peace deal with Syria and give the Golan Heights back. However, he was assassinated. Israel has been increasingly becoming more and more violent and genocidal. We saw what they're doing now. It's unlikely to have someone who will all of a sudden switch it from a greater Israel tone to an only peace tone. It's unlikely. It's unlikely. Turkish Truther, Salam Mahmoud reports the US has carried out airstrikes in Syria. Could this suggest they will start getting more involved in the escalation? Listen, anyone thinking that the United States is not involved in this escalation is not really reading things properly. The United States administration is worse than Israel. They are the ones enabling Israel. They are the ones funding them. They are the ones giving them weapons. They are the ones giving them money. In many cases, the supporters of the genocide entity from outside of it, and in the case of the United States primarily, are far worse than Israel itself. Because Israel does not sustain itself without the support of neo-colonialist countries. Look at all of the countries who support Israel. And look at their history. History is full of genocide and massacres and ethnic cleansing and enslavement and colonialism across the world. And that's why they support Israel, because Israel is an extension of them, of their enterprise. And this movement, I mean, I haven't heard the reports of American strikes directly, but this move coming from some of these armed groups in Syria has been clearly coordinated, signaling that, okay, we gave you a ceasefire, but we're not finished, and, you know, it's just a short breath, catching breath, and then we're gonna escalate. But the American side has been involved completely in all of this. And if they wanted to, they could have stopped this a long time ago. And ML is saying, Mahmoud heard the IDF took some people from southern Lebanon hostage after the ceasefire started early this morning. Have you heard anything like that? Yes, I did. And there is also one thing, by the way, that there are several Hezbollah prisoners still with Israel. There was no report of them being released, although Hezbollah tried to have it as a core thing, but I haven't heard reports that they were released. And there were gunshots, not to kill or wound anyone, but kind of warning shots coming from several Israeli tanks present in places in South Lebanon where they haven't withdrawn from. As a matter of fact, they declared a couple of areas in South Lebanon, Maroun al-Ras, Aitarun, and Yarun, closed military zones where no one is able to go back to. How much is that being implemented? Again, but we're talking about the first day. Everything is fragile. Everything could be torn apart tomorrow, right? But yeah, I did also hear that. And that all indicates, that even if we do have a ceasefire, we wouldn't have an ending of the problem. The problem is still there. The problem is still there, and the problem will continue so long as this Zionist entity exists, because they existed on all of the reasons that they are implementing now: ethnic cleansing, crimes, genocide. And great, True 204, thank you for that. Salam, do you think True Promise 3 will come from Iran before Trump takes office? I asked because the Israelis say one reason they pulled out of Lebanon is to go after Iran's nuclear program. Israel has been talking about Iran's nuclear program for 2 decades now. And they have been doing that, by the way, on behalf of the United States. So Israel has been the barking dog of the United States on Iran, and whenever we have tensions between the United States and Iran, Israel barks, and whenever we have a de-escalation, Israel stops barking. Israeli media used to post things against Iran every single day for years, and then all of a sudden stopped. Did the risk stop? Did Iran stop enriching uranium? No, they increased it. So why did you stop Israel? It's because the United States had a certain understanding with Iran, right? And Iran might have an attack before Trump comes in office. As a matter of fact, I think Trump coming into office wouldn't change what Iran is deciding to do. Iran will look at the progress of what's happening. Will they have a ceasefire with Gaza or not? If they won't have a ceasefire with Gaza, expect a massive blow. If they do have a ceasefire, massive blow bigger than True Promise 2 and 1. If they do have a ceasefire with Gaza, as in Israel, we will potentially still see a response that wouldn't necessarily be that big. Marvin is saying, regarding Syria and West Bank groups, you think Russia will help Syria, maybe Russian air support troop action? Well, Russia's already helping Syria. Russia's intervention in 2015 or 2016 was what stopped Syria from collapsing into the hands of the United States and Israel. It was Russia, because Russia had strategic ties with them. They already saw what they're doing in Libya and in other parts too, when they had very big deals with countries like Libya. And Syria was a step too much for them. And that's why these other countries started some of these interventions globally. It's because of how much of an expansionist state the United States is. They always want to impose their will on so many countries. And of course, side by side with Israel, because Israel is them and they are Israel. So they're already there and they will be playing a role. However, there are certain things when it comes to the exchanges, let's say, back and forth blows between Israel and Syria that are beyond Russia's responsibilities there. If that makes sense. Now, saying that, Russia has been increasingly displeased with Israeli behavior in Syria. So when we talk about the tensions ever since Israel started to escalate further in 2018, things have been only getting worse. But again, that's not necessarily to say that Russia will be doing, everything on behalf of the Syrian army or what have you. But there are cases where Russia will activate its air defense systems in Syria against Israeli attacks. Mika Yusuf saying Hezbollah said it won't stop hitting the Zio terror entity until they stop the genocide in Gaza. That's true. They said that. However, they said that when there wasn't an all-out war in Lebanon. They said that when there were limited exchanges between Israel and Hezbollah during the first 11 months, where Hezbollah in a calculated manner conducted attacks on Israel that were limited to send a message to Israel that we're not interested in an all-out war, but we also won't leave Gaza alone because we care for Gaza and we support the Palestinian people. So have a ceasefire so we can stop. Israel, with its typical arrogance, started to escalate with Hezbollah. That led Hezbollah to escalate up until it reached a stage where Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel decided to go on massive attacks on Lebanon. That led Hezbollah to increase all of their attacks on Israel, leading to escalation up until we reached the stage where Israel declared that they are now primarily focusing on Lebanon, running away from Gaza. Israel deploying most of its forces from Gaza to Lebanon was the excuse to potentially have a ceasefire with Gaza, under the pretext of we withdrew them for Lebanon because we want to escalate with them. Well, you haven't finished the job with Gaza. Why did you go to Lebanon? Right? You said you wanted to eliminate Hamas. You're far from that. Why don't you keep all of them to eliminate Hamas, right? Although that's a lie and it won't happen. But him sending them there to have this escalation and then reach a ceasefire and then saying we won't deploy these forces back to Gaza. What does that all tell you? That we're going to have a ceasefire, potentially have a ceasefire with Gaza. Again, these people are psychopaths, so you can't expect anything. But we're trying to analyze and read between the lines. Now, when we started to have a state of an all-out war in Lebanon, it stopped becoming a supporting front. The whole purpose of having a limited supporting front is not to attract a war on Lebanon, right? Because Hezbollah, they also are responsible when it comes to Lebanon. They don't want to attract all-out destruction. And despite Israel's crimes in Gaza, we have seen certain lines not being crossed. The attack on the airport, the attack on the energy power plants, the electric power plants, energy sectors, certain things. We didn't see a case of Gaza in Lebanon. We did not see that. And that was to a large extent due to Hezbollah's calculation. But we did have an open war now with Lebanon that could only go downhill, right? So Hezbollah's priority at that moment started to become end the war in Lebanon before ending the war in Gaza. Does that mean they left Gaza? No. How? Through this ceasefire agreement. What does this ceasefire agreement entail? Firstly, it's a limited ceasefire agreement. Secondly, we haven't really heard Hezbollah's position. Has anyone heard their position yet? When it comes to their official main position towards what's happening? No, we haven't had a confirmation from the Secretary General what's going to happen. Why? Because their priority was to end the war in Lebanon. But temporary ceasefire agreement for 2 months, when the Lebanese are allowed to go back to the south and the Israelis aren't allowed to go back to the north. The Israelis not being able to go back to the north? That is the thing that I would like you to focus on. Why is that? What if an Israeli does want to go back to the north? Why is he not able to? What is Israel preventing them from going back to the north? Their own state? It's their home, even if it's destroyed. Why can't I go back there? That's a clause imposed by Hezbollah, in effect, continuing the pressure on Israel without firing one bullet. And I showed you the videos today of one of the heads of the settlements in the north and how he was shouting at Netanyahu, and the meetings they had with him, swearing at him, and chaos, internal battles, without Hezbollah lifting a finger. Isn't that support for Gaza? That is support for Gaza, because you're making them fight between them. And also, most of the army is still deployed to Lebanon. Isn't that support for Gaza? That's support for Gaza. The whole purpose was to exhaust some of the military pressure so they don't use all of their arms in Gaza. Well, the majority of the armed forces, the genocide armed terror forces, are in Lebanon. They're not in Gaza. And we have a clarification from Israel that they're not going to be sent back to Gaza, these specific divisions in Lebanon. And we're talking about 5 divisions, most of which were fighting in Gaza too, by the way. So again, that could be Netanyahu's way of getting himself out of the 2 conflicts. Withdrawing from Gaza, deciding all of a sudden that he wants to focus on Lebanon, creating a 4th objective of the war. He had 3 objectives of the war up until 2 months ago: eliminating Hamas, getting all of the prisoners of war, and making sure Gaza doesn't pose a threat again. 2 months back, he decided he has a new objective. What is that objective? Getting the people back to the north. And I decide to deploy most of my forces to Lebanon for objective number 4. Is objective number 4 more pressing than 1, 2, and 3? Of course not. But you're doing that as a move towards ending everything. Again, theoretically, he can go in opposition to all of that, we know. But based on my reading of what's happening, he's doing that. I mean, I said at the time when it comes to him deploying in Lebanon, why are you going to Lebanon when you haven't finished the job in Gaza? As in the job, as in your declared objectives. So he's there, he has most of his forces, and Hezbollah, by preventing, Hezbollah are dictating what's happening in Israel. By preventing the Israeli settlers from going back to the north, what are they in effect doing? Making Netanyahu look like a massive lying, failed fool. Why? Because his objective for the escalation in Lebanon, the only declared objective of Israel when it comes to Lebanon, was to return the settlers back to the north. And he is now having a ceasefire with Lebanon without getting the people back to the north. What does that all say? That Lebanon is still a supporting front, Hezbollah. The majority of the Israeli forces are still there, not being used in Gaza. Benjamin Netanyahu is in internal turmoil, and he hasn't achieved his objective in Lebanon. What is all of that? Fail, 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 fail. And it appears to be that we will be looking at a potential ceasefire in Gaza soon. And again, all of that is reading through and viewing what's developing. Things could go in a different manner. And that was from Mika. Thank you for that. Gully Berg, interesting. Mahmoud, you speculate that things are slowing down in the West Asia region because NATO is about to hit Russia. From an American calculation, yes, that could be the case. And they could be prioritizing the weapons to NATO now, because if you want to talk about a big escalation that you can't guarantee the outcome of, although through this escalation, by the way, Russia and China, by the way, they've been very restrained after all of this US and NATO provocation against them. But Russia primarily. The United States went against almost every single thing they told them after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Whether when it comes to the lack of expansion eastwards of NATO, NATO is a defensive pact, and to the level where they have missiles on the borders with Russia. Up until Russia decided to stop it. Now, if they do decide to go and escalate, and there is a big risk of that from the evidence that we're seeing on the ground, then they can't guarantee how long that would take. If it's going to be taking a very long time, then the case would start depending on the supply chain and who can constantly produce more weapons for a longer time. You know, it's not just about a couple of blows and that's it. And, you know, couldn't Russia have ended with some severe blows everything in Ukraine? They could have. They decided not to because they didn't want to go that way. But the United States and NATO are pushing for escalation. And that could be a consideration. That could be a consideration. You know, the US would probably be thinking, you know, Russia's about to declare a strategic partnership with Iran. Iran is supporting resistance fronts, but they are increasing their ties with Russia. When it gets to the bottom of it, Russia is a bigger problem than them. If we take down Russia or give Russia a bigger blow, we would improve our position in West Asia. That could be another line of thinking when it comes to the US. Because Iran, in the past couple of decades, they increased their ties and coordination with China and with Russia. So the United States is thinking, okay, and they have more visible coordination militarily with Russia than they do with China. With China, it's more financial cooperation, energy. They're the biggest supplier of oil to China. But with Russia, evidence, you know, that they support each other militarily back and forth, and they are about to declare this agreement. And they're escalating now when we are due to have this declared agreement between Russia and Iran soon. So I think the assertion that things are linked, you know, I think this proposition is very accurate. I think things started to become much more linked than they would appear to be to the majority of the public. And, you know, decision makers in the United States would be thinking that I want to take down Russia now. And then if I do, I'll have a stronger position in West Asia. Question is, how far will they go? They're crossing red lines. That's the worrying thing. How far will they go? I mean, will it reach nuclear weapons? From the recklessness of Western powers, it could reach that stage. But fortunately, we have more reasonable players globally than Western powers. And that's why we are in a very, very big need for a multipolar world where this US hegemony is that's it, is done. Jennifer Bibi said he's made an agreement with Saudi Arabia to put pipeline through carrying teak for AI. Tech, you mean, I think. He called Iran, Syria, Lebanon the corridor of terror. The corridor of terror is the United States, NATO, Israel. That's the corridor of terror. The Iran, Syria, Lebanon, that's the corridor of resistance. The corridor of countries with active people who, you know, not just talk, but actually do things for human rights. Palestine, don't forget Palestine, please. So that's the corridor of terror. The corridor of terror is US, NATO, Israel. And that corridor of terror is, that's it, it's about to be put in its place, finally. But of course, you know, you're going to see escalations. It's not like it's just going to happen like that. Because the United States and the neo-colonialist powers allied to it, they have been used for too long. They've been used to getting away with their arrogance and violence and mass terror globally. And of course, brainwashing their populations in the process. Like we're spreading democracy in Iraq and we're worried about the rights of women in Afghanistan, right? And in effect, killing millions, right? And torturing them in Abu Ghraib and what have you, and many stories. But they might have an escalation before it goes down. And they're seeing that what's happening in West Asia is linked to Russia. And they don't like that. And is it a coincidence that they have been escalating with Russia following July, when Russia openly and outright was sending warplanes to Iran to prepare them? So the agreement with Saudi Arabia is not going to happen up until we have, let's say, stability, or what could be labeled as stability. Because Saudi Arabia, although their positions are very known, they have declared several times that they won't have an agreement with Israel so long as there is no agreement with Palestine. Ahsan F, can you speculate on True Promise 3 and what would be the response if Israel keeps continuing the genocide? If Israel keeps continuing the genocide and they don't de-escalate and reach a ceasefire with Gaza, meaning there's only a ceasefire with Lebanon, a temporary ceasefire with Lebanon, Iran will have a True Promise 3 that would include more than 500 missiles, supersonic and hypersonic, that would be landing on genocide bases alongside more sensitive locations that are not only necessarily linked with the genocide army. These could include power grids. It could include some of their, well, declared nuclear facilities. And I mean, Iran already attacked an oil rig, right? So it could increase. Sorry, they attacked an oil gas field. In True Promise 2, a gas field off the shores of Ashkelon or Asqalan was in flames. How did that happen? Unless it was someone else coordinating with Iran, because Iran declared military targets. But did they include that as their military? So this is what I think. I think it will be more than double in terms of size and force than True Promise 2. If Israel does reach a ceasefire with Gaza and Iran sees that they are on the path to de-escalate, then we might have a limited response from Iran. Now, limited response, again, the limited response could be certain missiles on limited numbers of bases, right? Or an attack with a pre-warning, something like that. Okay, let's take the last couple of questions. And ML as well, thank you for your super. Okay, I'll end it with Tam. Tam, Mahmoud, are Hamas still recruiting the same numbers as being reported by the MSM? Hamas do not have a problem with the recruitment. The biggest recruiter for Hamas was Israel. Israel, by continuing its crimes against humanity, its barbarism against the Palestinian people, its genocide, its infanticide, its crimes that are worse than any crimes ever seen in human history, committed by this genocidal ethno-state. They are the biggest recruiters of Hamas. That's why we had a poll just a couple of days ago. I spoke about it too. That 2/3 of young Jewish population in the United States openly supported Hamas, openly showed support for Hamas. What does that tell you? That the biggest recruiter for Hamas and all of the resistance against Israel, including armed resistance, is Israel itself by its actions. Because, well, they have shown the global population for the past year now that they are a sick, depraved, and genocidal entity full of hate and supremacy and every ugly trait that can come across any human mind, that only understands the language of force and violence. And when they are met with force and violence, they only then will they start taking certain steps back, and that's also evident by history. They occupied Sinai, expelled by force, occupied South Lebanon, expelled by force. They occupied Gaza before, expelled by force, and now they are expelled by force yet again from Lebanon. They will be expelled by force from Gaza, and eventually they will be expelled from Palestine by force. And we'll wrap it up there, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in for another show. Imru, Marvin, ML, Great True, Glenn Huxley, Trill Iman, thank you all. Everyone else who participated as well, much appreciated. And apologies we couldn't reach all of your comments. I'll hopefully be with you with a video after this and another live stream tomorrow. In the meantime, stay blessed, take care, and I will see you soon in the next video. Peace, everyone.